The earth shook, the rocks split apart, and the dead walked out of their tombs. Nobody made that up. A witness who was there recorded it. Matthew chapter 27 verses 51 through 53. And what you're going to discover today is that each of those events has an explanation nobody has told you, because what happened in the last 3 hours of Jesus on the cross wasn't just an execution. It was something that shook the very fabric of reality, and there's evidence for it. But before we get to the open tombs, you need to understand what happened to the sky, because that's where it all started. It was noon. In Jerusalem at that hour, the sun is directly overhead. There's no shadow, no shelter. The heat is so brutal that the marketplace merchants lower their awnings, and people press against the temple walls looking for some relief. But that day, at 12 noon, something happened that made the entire city stop. The sun disappeared. Matthew chapter 27 verse 45 puts it this way: From the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. Mark chapter 15 verse 33 confirms it in almost the same words. Luke chapter 23 verse 44 adds a detail the other two don't mention. The sun was darkened. 3 hours of darkness in the middle of the day over all the land. Now, the first thing someone might think is that it was a solar eclipse, and in fact, a Roman historian named Thallus, who wrote around the year 52 after Christ, tried to explain that darkness exactly that way. He said it was an eclipse, but there's a massive problem with that explanation, and once you understand it, you'll see why this event is much harder to dismiss than it seems. The Jewish Passover is always celebrated during a full moon. Always. It's one of the fixed rules of the Hebrew calendar, and a solar eclipse can only occur during a new moon. It is physically impossible for a solar eclipse to happen during a full moon. The moon has to be between the earth and the sun to block the light, and during a full moon, the moon is on the opposite side. So whatever darkened the sky over Jerusalem that Friday was not an eclipse. And Thallus knew it. That's why Julius Africanus, a 3rd century Christian chronographer who quoted Thallus, responded directly by pointing out that astronomical contradiction. So if it wasn't an eclipse, what was it? That question has gone 2,000 years without a satisfactory naturalistic answer. But there's something else you need to know about those 3 hours of darkness, because the Bible doesn't present them as a random weather event. In the Old Testament, darkness in the middle of the day has a very specific meaning. Amos chapter 8, verse 9 says, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. Amos wrote that about 750 years before the crucifixion. Joel chapter 2, verse 31 says, The sun shall be turned to darkness, and the moon to blood, before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. Zephaniah chapter 1 verse 15 speaks of the day of wrath as a day of darkness and gloom. Do you see the pattern? In the Hebrew mind, supernatural darkness in the middle of the day meant one thing: judgment, the direct intervention of God in human affairs. And what was happening on that hill outside Jerusalem, according to the New Testament writers, was exactly that. The moment when the weight of all human sin fell on a single person. And this is where the story gets far more intense than most people realize. If what you're hearing has already made you connect things you've never seen before, hit the like button on this video, because what comes next is even stronger. During those 3 hours of darkness, Jesus said nothing. The Gospels don't record a single word from him between the 6th hour and the 9th hour. 3 hours of absolute silence. And if you understand what was happening on the spiritual plane according to Pauline theology, that silence takes on a devastating weight. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 says that God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us. Galatians chapter 3, verse 13 says that Christ was made a curse for us. Isaiah chapter 53 verse 6, written about 700 years earlier, says that the Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. Those 3 hours of darkness were not a blackout. According to the biblical text, they were the darkest moment in cosmic history, the moment when the relationship between the Father and the Son was fractured for the first time since eternity. And that brings us to the cry. Matthew chapter 27, verse 46. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which translated means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That phrase is a direct quote from Psalm 22, verse 1, but Jesus didn't say it in pure Hebrew. He said it in Aramaic, the language he spoke every day. And there's something about that detail that theologians have debated for centuries. When someone is in a moment of extreme pain, they don't recite liturgical texts. They speak in their mother tongue. They speak from the gut. And Jesus in that moment screamed in Aramaic. That suggests he wasn't making a calculated theological reference. He was living what Psalm 22 prophetically described. He was feeling it in his own flesh. And there's something in Psalm 22 that a lot of people haven't seen, because that psalm, written by David about 1,000 years before the crucifixion, describes details that David could never have experienced. Verse 16, "They pierced my hands and my feet." David was never crucified. Crucifixion didn't even exist as a method of execution in David's time. It was invented by the Persians and perfected by the Romans centuries later. Verse 18, "They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots." John chapter 19 verses 23 and 24 records that the Roman soldiers did exactly that with Jesus' clothes. Verse 14, "I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint." That is medically what happens during a crucifixion. The weight of the body hanging by the arms separates the shoulder joints and causes what we today call bilateral dislocation. How did David describe 1,000 years earlier a method of execution that didn't exist in his time, with medical details that only modern science has been able to confirm? But wait, because we still haven't reached the moment that split history in two. Jesus died. Matthew chapter 27 verse 50 says that he cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. John chapter 19 verse 30 adds a detail the other gospel writers don't mention. Jesus said, "It is finished," and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. That phrase in Greek is tetelestai, and if there's one single word you need to understand from everything you're hearing today, it's that one. Tetelestai doesn't simply mean it's over. In 1st century Greek, that word had a very specific commercial use. When someone finished paying off a debt, the creditor would write tetelestai on the document. It meant paid in full, debt cancelled, nothing left outstanding. Archaeologists have found 1st century tax receipts in Egypt with that same word written across them. It wasn't a religious word. It was a word from the marketplace, the bank, the debt collector. And Jesus, with his last breath, used it to describe what he had just done. That alone is staggering. But what happened immediately afterward is what made the toughest men in Jerusalem tremble. Matthew chapter 27 verse 51. The veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. You need to understand what that veil was to grasp why this was so devastating. The temple veil was not a decorative curtain. According to Jewish sources, including the Talmud in the tractate Yoma, that veil was approximately 60 feet tall, about 30 feet wide, and a handbreadth thick, which is roughly 3 to 4 inches. The historian Josephus, in his work The Wars of the Jews, Book 5, Chapter 5, describes it as a tapestry embroidered with blue, fine linen, scarlet and purple, representing the universe. Josephus says it was so thick that 2 horses tied to each end could not have torn it apart. And it was torn from top to bottom. That's a detail Matthew includes with surgical precision. He doesn't just say it was torn. He says from top to bottom. If someone had torn that fabric from the ground, the tear would start from the bottom going up. but a tier that begins from the top, 60 feet up, in a fabric that two horses couldn't rip apart, has no human explanation. And what that veil represented is even more important than the veil itself. The veil separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was the space where the presence of God was believed to dwell. No one could enter it except the high priest, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, described in Leviticus chapter 16. Anyone else who crossed that veil would die. That's how sacred that space was. And at the exact moment Jesus said, "Tetelestai," that veil was ripped open. The barrier between God and humanity, according to the biblical text, ceased to exist. The author of Hebrews explains it directly. Hebrews chapter 10 verses 19 through 20 says, "Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the Holy of Holies by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the veil, that is, through his flesh." If you're grasping the magnitude of what I'm saying, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because what's coming next is going to shake everything you thought you knew about that Friday. But the veil wasn't the only thing that broke. Matthew chapter 27, verse 51 continues, "And the earth shook and the rocks were split, an earthquake," at the exact moment of Jesus' death. Now, something many people don't know is that Jerusalem sits on the Jordan Rift Valley Fault, one of the most active geological faults in the world. It stretches from Syria to Mozambique. Earthquakes in that region are not unusual. In fact, geologists have documented significant seismic activity in the area during the 1st century. In 2012, geologists Jefferson Williams, Marcus Schwab, and A. Brower published a study in the International Geology Review analyzing Dead Sea sediments. They found evidence of a significant earthquake between the years 26 and 36 after Christ, which coincides with the period when most historians place the crucifixion. But here's what nobody tells you. The fact that there's a geological explanation doesn't diminish the event. It makes it more impressive. Because if God used a natural phenomenon, that means the seismic moment was coordinated to the second with the death of a specific man on a specific hill. The timing is the miracle, not the absence of a natural cause. Think of it this way. Imagine you're in a hospital. Someone you love is in their final moments. The doctors have prepared you. You know it could happen any second. And at the exact moment that person closes their eyes for the last time, the ground beneath your feet trembles. The hospital walls vibrate, the lights flicker, and when you step into the hallway, you discover the earthquake was felt across the entire city. Would you call that a coincidence? Or would you feel like something bigger was happening? Now multiply that by 1,000,000, because it wasn't just an earthquake. Matthew chapter 27 verse 52 says something that is perhaps the most disturbing event in the entire crucifixion narrative. "And the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised." Read that again. The tombs opened, the dead rose, and verse 53 adds, "And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many." This is one of the most debated passages in the entire New Testament. Only Matthew records it. Mark, Luke, and John don't mention it, and that has led many scholars to question whether it's literal or symbolic. But there's something those critics tend to overlook. The absence of an event in one gospel doesn't mean it didn't happen. Each gospel writer selected the details that served his theological purpose and his audience. Mark wrote a compact, fast-paced, action-oriented account, probably for a Roman audience that wanted concrete facts. Luke was a meticulous historian, but wasn't in Jerusalem during the crucifixion. John wrote decades later with a deeply theological focus centered on Jesus' words, not on the external phenomena. Matthew, on the other hand, wrote for a Jewish audience, and for a first-century Jew, the resurrection of the saints carried a specific theological meaning that the other gospel writers didn't need to emphasize for their audiences. In Jewish eschatology, the resurrection of the dead was a sign of the end times. Daniel chapter 12 verse 2 says it clearly. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Ezekiel chapter 37 describes the famous valley of dry bones, where God raises the dead as a sign of ultimate restoration. For a Jewish reader of Matthew, the tomb's opening wasn't a detail of horror. It was an explosive theological declaration. Matthew was saying, the end times event that Daniel and Ezekiel prophesied has just begun, and it started at the exact moment Jesus died. And there's a detail in verse 53 that many people read without stopping. After his resurrection, the bodies were raised when Jesus died, but they came out of the tombs after Jesus rose again. That means Matthew is describing a process that lasted 3 days. The tombs opened on Friday, but the resurrected saints didn't appear in Jerusalem until Sunday. Why that 3-day interval? Because according to 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 20, Christ is the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The first fruits were the first portion of the harvest offered to God before gathering the rest. Jesus had to rise first, then the others, and that changes the entire reading of what happened that Friday. It wasn't just a death, it was the trigger of a chain reaction that reached into the graves. But there's still someone in this story we haven't mentioned. Someone who knew nothing about Jewish prophecies, or Daniel, or Ezekiel, or Psalm 22. Someone who was there simply because it was his job. And what that person said at the end changed everything. If you didn't expect what I just revealed about the 3 days, imagine what comes next. The Centurion. Matthew chapter 27 verse 54 says, The centurion and those who were with him keeping watch over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that had happened, feared greatly and said, Truly, this was the Son of God. You need to understand who this man was to measure the weight of what he said. A Roman centurion was a military officer in charge of between 80 and 100 soldiers. He wasn't a young recruit or an ordinary soldier. To reach the rank of centurion, a Roman had to have demonstrated years of discipline, courage, and loyalty to the empire. They were the backbone of the most powerful army in the world, and their loyalty was not to any Jewish god. It was to Rome and to the emperor. The centurion assigned to oversee Jesus' crucifixion had watched dozens, probably hundreds of people die on crosses. Crucifixion was part of his job. It wasn't something that kept him up at night. He had developed the same kind of desensitization that forensic pathologists or soldiers in war zones develop. Death on the cross was routine. But something happened that day that shattered that routine into 1,000 pieces. That centurion watched 3 hours of darkness. He stood on that hill with a black sky above his head for 180 minutes. He felt the earth shake beneath his feet. He saw the rocks split, and he heard a dying man scream in Aramaic words he probably didn't understand. And after all of that, a pagan soldier, trained to show no emotion, forged in the most brutal discipline of the ancient world, a man whose entire identity was built on the authority of Rome and the divinity of Caesar, looked at the lifeless body of a Jewish carpenter and said, Truly, this was the Son of God. Luke chapter 23, verse 47 records it with a subtle but important variation. The centurion, when he saw what had happened, glorified God, saying, Certainly this was a righteous man. That doesn't contradict Matthew. It complements it. The centurion said both things, or Matthew and Luke recorded different facets of the same reaction. The point is that an officer of the empire who crucified Jesus ended up glorifying the God of Israel. And there's something else this centurion saw that Mark chapter 15 verse 39 specifies with revealing precision. When the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, Truly, this man was the Son of God. Mark says he was standing facing him, face to face, mere feet away. He didn't see it from a distance. He was looking directly into his eyes when he died. And what he saw in that death was so different from every other death he had ever witnessed that it compelled him to say what he said. What did he see? The crucified normally died, cursing, screaming in pain, losing control of their bodily functions, begging to be killed. It was a degrading spectacle designed to dehumanize. But Jesus, according to Luke chapter 23, verse 34, said from the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Luke chapter 23, verse 43, records that he told a criminal crucified next to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." And John chapter 19, verses 26 and 27, says he cared for his mother, telling John, "Behold your mother." A man being tortured to death forgives his torturers, promises paradise to a criminal, and worries about his mom. The centurion had never seen that. Nobody had ever seen that. And combined with the darkness, the earthquake, and the splitting rocks, the only conclusion this soldier could reach was that the man he had just executed was no ordinary man. But there's a political detail that most people completely ignore, and it makes the centurion's confession even more dangerous than it seems. In the Roman Empire, only the emperor held the title Son of God. Caesar Augustus was officially called Divi Filius, Son of the Divine. Tiberius, the reigning emperor during Jesus' crucifixion, inherited that title. To call anyone else Son of God was an act of political treason. It was blasphemy against the state. And this centurion, a functionary of the Roman state, standing before the body of a man Rome had just executed for sedition, spoke the title reserved exclusively for Caesar. He said it out loud, in front of his soldiers, in front of the Jewish priests who had requested the execution, in front of everyone. That was not a casual remark. That was a statement that could have cost him his career and possibly his life. What did that man see that led him to risk everything? Think about it from another angle. Imagine you're a 19-year-old. You grew up hearing that the story of Jesus is a myth. They told you that at school, on the internet, everywhere. And one day, out of curiosity or boredom, you open the Gospel of Matthew and reach chapter 27. And you read that a Roman soldier, a man with no religious reason to believe, a man whose job was literally killing people, looked at Jesus dead on the cross and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." And you ask yourself, what did that man have to see to say something like that? That question isn't comfortable, but it's honest. And there's something else you need to know about that Friday, because there's an event Matthew records that connects with a prophecy so ancient most people don't even know it exists. The earthquake split the rocks. Matthew chapter 27, verse 51 says specifically, the rocks were split. And Nahum chapter 1, verse 5 says, the mountains tremble before him, and the hills melt away. The earth quakes at his presence, the world and all who dwell in it. Nahum wrote that about 650 years before Christ. And he's describing what happens when God shows up in judgment. The earth shakes, the rocks split, the world trembles. And that's exactly what Matthew records happened at Calvary. But the most chilling prophetic connection isn't Nahum, it's Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4 prophesies that the Lord's feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will be split in two. Geologists have confirmed that the Mount of Olives has a geological fault running through it right down the middle. A fault that could be activated by an earthquake of sufficient magnitude. And Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified, is less than a kilometer from the Mount of Olives. The earthquake that split the rocks when Jesus died shook the same area where Zechariah prophesied the mountain would split. Coincidence? Perhaps. But the coincidences are starting to pile up. Darkness prophesied by Amos, hands and feet pierced, prophesied by Psalm 22, 1,000 years before crucifixion existed. Garments divided and lots cast, same psalm. Earthquake, prophesied by Nahum. Resurrection of the dead, prophesied by Daniel and Ezekiel. Each of those events occurred within a 3-hour window on a single Friday on the outskirts of Jerusalem. If this is shaking you on the inside, subscribe to this channel, because you need to know what nobody has told you about this story. Now I want you to think about something almost nobody considers. What happened in the temple when the veil was torn? Remember, it was Passover. Thousands of pilgrims were in Jerusalem. The temple was packed. The priests were performing the afternoon sacrifices, and suddenly, without warning, the massive veil separating the Holy of Holies was ripped from top to bottom. Imagine the sound. A fabric 60 feet tall and nearly 4 inches thick tearing apart. It must have been deafening. The priests who were in the holy place, just on the other side of the veil, could suddenly see what no one had seen in generations, the empty space where the Ark of the Covenant once stood. And think about what that meant for them in that instant. Their entire lives, their entire identity, all their priestly training revolved around that veil. That veil was the physical symbol of the separation between God and man. It was the line that could not be crossed, and suddenly that line ceased to exist. The Talmud records something fascinating in the tractate Yoma, chapter 39b. It says that 40 years before the destruction of the temple, which occurred in the year 70, several strange things began to happen. The lot for the Lord did not fall on the right hand. The crimson thread stopped turning white, the temple doors would open by themselves during the night, and the western lamp of the candelabrum would go out on its own. 40 years before the year 70 is the year 30, the approximate year of Jesus' crucifixion. The Talmud is not a Christian text. It is the compilation of the rabbinic oral tradition. And without trying to prove anything about Jesus, it records that something changed in the temple at exactly around the time the Gospels say the veil was torn. That's not definitive proof, but it's a detail that should at least make you raise an eyebrow. Now let's go back to the dead who were raised, because there's another layer to that event that almost nobody explores. Matthew says they were saints. In Greek, the word is hagios. He doesn't say they were just anyone. He says they were saints, people who had lived in faithfulness to God. And he says they appeared to many in Jerusalem after Jesus' resurrection. They appeared to many, not in secret, not in dreams. They appeared. They were seen by multiple witnesses in the holy city. And here's something that critics who dismiss this passage as a legendary addition need to consider. If Matthew invented this story, he invented it in the worst possible way. A myth inventor would have put those resurrected saints doing spectacular things. He would have described their names, their stories, their messages. He would have made that event the center of the narrative. But Matthew mentions it in 2 verses. 2. And he gives no names, he describes no dialogue, he narrates no reactions, he just says it happened and moves on. That is exactly what someone would do who is reporting a fact so overwhelming he doesn't know how to process it. He doesn't embellish it. He doesn't explain it. He just records it. And there's another detail most people miss. Matthew wrote his gospel for Jews living in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, many of whom were still alive when the gospel circulated. If the resurrected saints hadn't appeared to anyone, including that claim in a text directed at people who could verify, it would have destroyed the credibility of the entire gospel. Matthew would not have included something so easy to disprove unless he knew there were witnesses. And that brings us to a question I want you to carry with you after this video. Everything you just heard, the 3 hours of darkness, the cry in Aramaic, The torn veil, the earthquake, the split rocks, the open tombs, the Centurion's confession, all of it happened within a span of roughly 180 minutes surrounding the death of a single man. A carpenter from Nazareth who never wrote a book, who never led an army, who never held political office, who lived 33 years in a forgotten corner of the Roman Empire. And when he died, the sky went dark, the earth shook, the temple broke, the dead rose, and a Roman centurion committed treason against the empire with 5 words. If he wasn't who he claimed to be, why did the universe react? That's the question. And nobody has been able to answer it in 2,000 years. But if he was who he claimed to be, if he truly was the Son of God, then what happened that Friday wasn't a tragedy. It was the moment the debt was cancelled, tetelestai, paid in full. And the crack in the veil is still open. There's a video on screen right now that connects directly with what you just discovered. What you're about to see there will challenge something you thought you already knew. If you made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated in a place you didn't expect. Don't stop at half. Click that video and keep going, because what comes next is even deeper than what you just heard.